Hello folks, welcome to the RaptorTechPCS channel. Today we're going to do a build for one of the Twitch celebrities, Blonde Like Monroe. I'll post a link at the bottom so you can check out her page on Twitch. What we're going to do is a system consisting of the i7-8700K processor, the ASRock Z390 Pro 4 motherboard, 16 gigabytes of G-Skill DDR4-3200 Rampage RAM, the Gigabyte GeForce RTX 2060 Super Windforce overclock dual fan 8 GB graphics card, 1 terabyte solid state drive from us, RaptorTech, and a 2 terabyte Seagate Barracuda 7200 RPM hard drive. We're going to cool the CPU with the CoolerMaster Hyper 212 RGB Black Universal CPU cooler. Power is going to be provided by our Power Spec 650 watt 80 plus gold modular power supply, and we're going to house this in the CoolerMaster MasterCase H500 RGB glass case, tempered glass case I should say. And we're going to add Wi-Fi and Bluetooth with the ASUS AC1200 Bluetooth dual band network adapter. First thing we're going to do is to prep the case by removing this rear panel and the front panel to prepare it for the installation of the motherboard and all of the components. Also, now we're going to install the RGB fans. Since we're going with the CoolerMaster case, we might as well go with CoolerMaster fans. So we're going to use the MasterFan Pro 3-pack of fans. Now originally I had ordered a 120 from my distributor, but for some reason they gave me a 140, which is cool. I wouldn't complain, but in the rear panel of the case it only takes a 120 millimeter drive. So I'm going to go grab another 120 millimeters so I can just stick there, and we're going to stick the two 140s at top. So it's a blessing and it's a curse. So Sandra, you've been with him since day one. And of course the RGB LED controller, we're going to use that for all of the fans since the motherboard itself doesn't have an RGB header. But this will allow you to control it from software. So it's like it would have it, I guess, in this case. And then like I said, that 140 doesn't fit in there, but it's a perfect fit for the top. So we're going to mount the two up at top. And those are going to be pulling air in, while the rear will be the exhaust pushing air out. Same as with the 200 millimeter fans in front, they're going to be pulling air in.
because you never know what they're doing in the wheelhouse. You don't even know if they're in the wheelhouse.
Boy, what a big boat shoveling that rail.
Anything on the bottom is going to get caught in that net. And our anchor's on the bottom. You hope he makes his turn before he picks up your anchor in his net. If he doesn't turn, you don't have time to pull your anchor, and it takes too long. In the right circumstance, you could roll the boat over, and that's it, you're done. The chances you get out from underneath it are slim and none. So there's a real chance that you could get very seriously injured. You think, what can I do? But really, you're helpless at that point.
That dragger goes across our anchor and tangles it, and then the war will begin.
Now, this guy's pretty close in this dragger
Hey,
around.
that might do it, Bart.
This isn't gonna work. He's gonna go for a Nantucket sleigh ride here in a minute.
It's a really scary situation. He could actually wind up sinking you.
This is gonna be close.
Here we go. Don't tell your mother.
Dad, it's fine. We have
Allstate. And with plane rate guards, they won't raise your rates just because of the plane.
This flight my favorite.
Kind of. Are you in good hands?
shirts, sheets, hand towels, bath towels, gym wear, underwear, or whatever wear. You can't skip laundry, but now you can skip adding detergent. Fill once and wash up to 40 loads. Select Whirlpool washers with load and no dispenser. Another way we're shaping future care.
Let's be real about unreal estate. Impeccably manicured lawns, infinitely cool infinity pools, over the top everything. Who lives like this? Probably not you, because you're real, and what real people need are real homes. At Realtor.com, we're serious about real, so we use real-time updates to give you the most comprehensive view of homes for sale nationwide. We know the first step in resting easy at night is finding a real place to rest your head, and together we'll find homes for the real of us. Realtor.com, the home of home search.
Here we go.
Sleigh ride. Yeah.
We're on it. He hooked our anchor and towed us away. When I tried to call him on the radio, there was no response. Literally, they pulled us right under.
He wasn't stopping until something broke, and our anchor line can't take the pressure and it snaps.
You got our anchor! Hey! Yep.
I was scared. I was scared.
Yeah, we just deliberately got assaulted by the fishing vessel. Took our anchor, towed us away.
This is what's left. When a dragger grabs your anchor,
Went over to him, tried to talk to him.
what the? No! No, Jay! Throwing fish at me?
Unbelievable. He started throwing dead fish at us. I could not believe what I was seeing.
You know, if they got whole ocean, they gotta come right.
Yeah, right next to you.
Smash them up! You can yell all you want, bro.
Now, like I said, we don't have the 120 millimeter for the rear yet, so we're going to add that a little bit later.
Then I'll hang it. And what it does is scare the other birds away.
Okay, the motherboard we're going with is the ASRock Z390 Pro 4 motherboard, which can support up to 64 gigabytes of RAM, has 7.1 onboard audio, can support M.2 memory cards, and is fully overclockable, even though we're not going to overclock this build, as well as crossfire support, but we won't be needing that since we're using a single RTX card. Now, with the processor, we're going to use the Intel i7-8700K Coffee Lake processor, which is a 3.76 core, 12 thread processing with a max speed of 4.2, if I remember correctly. Yes, 4.2. And then we're going to cool it as you'll see later on with the CoolerMaster Hyper 212 cooler. So we're going to install this onto the motherboard. And then if you've never installed a CPU before, you always want to take care and pay attention to detail as to placing the CPU in place so you don't damage the pins that you're laying it upon. Now with the RAM, like I said, we're going to use the G.Skill Ripjaws DDR4-3200 speed memory modules for this installation. Of course, G.Skill being the most popular RAM on the market right now next to Corsair products. Majority of the builds that we do use either use the Ripjaw DDR4-3200 speed or the Aegis 3000 speed, with a few exceptions for some AMD builds. We don't use the Aegis RAM for the AMD builds because they have a compatibility issue with a lot of the motherboards. But with Intel, it works fine without any problems. Now for CPU cooling, we're going to go with an air cooler this time instead of liquid cooling. And with that, we're going to use the CoolerMaster Hyper 212 RGB Black Edition CPU cooler. Comes with a 120mm RGB fan. And I know a lot of people don't like a lot of people don't like air cooling, or they don't agree with air cooling. But most of the coolers out there, including the Hyper 212, will get decent performance, as well as some liquid coolers out on the market. So what we're going to do here is set up the cooler itself. We're going to mount the bottom bracket that goes underneath the motherboard so we can install the actual unit itself. Now these are universal kits, so these can be used for either AMD, Ryzen, or Intel motherboard processor combinations. This isn't recommended for such as the TR4, or I should say the Ryzen Threadripper processors. They use a completely different mounting for their motherboards. And then, like I said, we're going to go ahead and mount this up underneath from the bottom into the motherboard, so each bolt is coming through the holes surrounding the CPU. And then we're going to install the standoffs for those and for the cooler itself. Now that we have the standoffs mounted, we can go ahead and complete adding the CPU cooler to this. We'll assemble the body of the CPU cooler, then add some thermal grease to the processor itself. Now everybody has their preference on thermal paste. We use the Arctic MX4 thermal grease. It's one of the best ones out there. We do not use the stuff that comes in the box with the liquid coolers or even the air coolers because it's just not good enough. According to the manufacturer, you can just do one application and it'll last for 8 years, even though I probably wouldn't go as far as 4 years without changing it out. Now most people use the X method or the 5-point method. That's too much thermal paste to be using. I just put a single dot on the CPU. Then when you mount the cooler, whether it's the air cooler or the liquid cooler, spin it, move it around a little bit so it spreads out the grease onto the CPU. Not too much pressure though. And that's all you need. Anything else is simply too much. And we'll go ahead and bolt this down. Now I usually go in a cross pattern instead of going around clockwise or counterclockwise to make sure it's evenly mounted on there. Okay, now we have our CPU cooler installed. We're going to put this to the side and bring the case back so we can start installing everything into the case itself. First, we'll install the I/O shield for the motherboard, and then we'll install the standoffs for the motherboard. Now with the I/O shield and standoffs mounted, we'll go ahead and install the motherboard. Now the power supply we're going with is the Power Spec 80 Plus Gold 650 watt power supply. A lot of people aren't too familiar with the brand. It's been out for about 2 years now. I know Micro Center is a big carrier and pusher of this product. Their power supplies are surprisingly very, very good. I've had these outperform some Corsairs as far as reliability goes. So we're going to use this particular one, the 650 watt, for this build, which is more than enough power to, it's almost more than we need, but more is always good, especially since we're just going with the 2060 Super. The storage drive we're going with is the Seagate Barracuda 2TB 7200 RPM SATA drive. This will be used for storage of documents, files, and then any games that do not fit on the 1TB solid state drive. Our 1TB solid state drive is mounted in the rear of the case, behind the motherboard. So here's where we're at. We got it partially wired up. We got the motherboard, power supply, and the drives installed. Now we just need to finish wiring up the front panel and add the Wi-Fi adapter and graphics card. We're going to install the Wi-Fi adapter next after we have the front panel now hooked up and everything. This is an ASUS dual band, which is the AC1200 Wi-Fi as well as Bluetooth connectivity. We're going to mount this at the very top above the graphics card. Since it's small and it won't interfere with any type of airflow or anything, rather than mounting it underneath and having the antennas in the way of your monitor cable connections. And as you can see, we have the Wi-Fi adapter installed. Like I said, it's small, unobtrusive, and out of the way, so it's not going to affect anything with the graphics card. And speaking of the graphics card, we're going to go with the Gigabyte GeForce RTX 2060 Super Overclock 8GB graphics card for this build. It's a dual fan card. I haven't seen a triple fan card yet. We'll probably never see one, so this will work just fine. As you can see, we have the card now installed into the system. We have all the wiring completed. We try to keep it as simple as possible and as neat as possible for appearances. The only thing we have to do now is install the operating system as well and the drivers and test it out. I also still have to install the 120mm rear fan in the back. I'm waiting for that to get here to complete this build, but I don't have to wait for that to set everything else up with it. So let's power it on just to make sure it pops on. And there we go. It's up and running like it should. All of the fans are running like they should. The RGB lighting is working. You'll have more control of it after the software has been installed, where you can change it to whatever pattern you want. And there you have it, a system that is capable of doing 1440p resolution at 50 to 60 frames per second, as well as streaming capabilities without any problems. I thank you for watching. I thank Blonde Like Monroe for allowing us to build this system for her gaming and Twitch account needs. Make sure to check her out. Make sure to check out our videos as well. Thank you. Take care.